They pulled him from his vehicle, detained him with baseless accusations until he had no choice but to disclose his true identity. That calm evening in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when the streets were mostly silent except for the occasional hum of traffic lights switching from red to green, Jamal Winslow, a seasoned assistant U.S. attorney, had just left a dinner with colleagues, his thoughts solely on getting home. That tranquility shattered the moment he spotted blinking red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. With a resigned sigh, he signaled and pulled over, reaching for his wallet. He wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light. There was no legitimate reason for a stop, but experience had taught him not to expect logic in such moments. Two officers then approached his window. Officer Kyle Driscoll, tall and broad with a military cut, stationed himself at the driver's side, while Officer Brent Kessler, equally imposing, hovered by the passenger door. "License and registration," Driscoll demanded in a clipped tone, and Jamal handed over his documents without hesitation. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Jamal inquired calmly. Driscoll exchanged a glance with Kessler before answering. "Your taillight's out." Jamal frowned. This was a lie. His car had just passed inspection, and the reflection in his rearview mirror clearly showed fully functional brake lights. "Are you sure about that?" he asked evenly. Driscoll's expression shifted slightly as he leaned in. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," he ordered. A cold tension crept through Jamal's limbs. He had prosecuted cases where routine stops escalated into far worse situations. His instinct urged him to comply, but his experience warned him that these officers were already escalating the encounter. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why," he stated firmly. Kessler smirked and rested his hand casually on his belt. "Because we said so," he replied curtly. Jamal took a deep breath. He had spent years studying the law, both enforcing it and defending it, and he knew he wasn't obliged to exit his car without probable cause. "I'm within my rights to ask why I'm being ordered out of my vehicle," he said. At that, Driscoll's patience snapped. He yanked the door open and commanded, "Step out now!" Before Jamal could react, Driscoll grabbed his wrist and forcefully pulled him forward. The seatbelt dug harshly into his chest and shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" Jamal barked, instinctively pulling back. Driscoll said nothing, only tightening his grip. Within seconds, Kessler was on the other side, wrenching Jamal's arm behind his back until the cold, sharp edge of metal cuffs bit into his skin. "You're resisting," Driscoll stated coldly. Jamal stared in disbelief as Kessler pressed him against the hood of his own car. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from rage. This was a setup, and they believed they had already won. But they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Later, in the packed courtroom of the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, the air was thick with the mundane sounds of clerks shuffling papers, occasional coughs and whispered conversations. Yet beneath that, an undercurrent of tension simmered. Jamal Winslow sat at the defense table, his posture rigid but composed, ready to confront the injustice that had unfolded that night. He wasn't there in court as a lawyer today. He was the defendant. The charges: resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct, complete fabrications. But Jamal already knew that, in this system, the truth didn't matter. Only what could be proven did. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Margaret Holloway, in her mid-60s and exuding an aura of unchallengeable authority, fixed her steely gaze on him. Her reputation was firm and uncompromising, and the way she barely spared him a glance told Jamal exactly how this was going to end. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, walked in with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the odds were stacked in his favor. He straightened his tie and nodded toward the officers, Driscoll and Kessler, who sat at the witness stand with smug expressions, secure in the full weight of the system behind them. "Your Honor," Calloway began, "this is a straightforward case of an individual escalating a routine traffic stop into a physical altercation with law enforcement." Jamal exhaled slowly at the sheer arrogance and audacity of it all. Flipping through his notes, Calloway continued, "The defendant refused to comply with lawful orders, became aggressive, and had to be restrained for the safety of everyone involved." At that moment, Jamal's lawyer, Thomas Rivera, an overworked and underpaid public defender, leaped to his feet. "Objection. There is zero evidence that my client was aggressive." Judge Holloway waved a hand dismissively. "Overruled." Jamal clenched his jaw at the rapid dismissal. Rivera sighed but pressed on. "Your Honor, the officers escalated the situation without just cause. There is no body cam footage showing my client acting aggressively because no such footage exists." Calloway smirked. Body cams weren't operational at the time of the arrest, but the officers' statements are more than enough evidence. Jamal nearly laughed at the absurdity. The officer's word was all they needed. Driscoll then took the stand, delivering his well-rehearsed testimony. The defendant was combative from the start, refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, and created a hostile situation. Lies, Jamal thought. Every word was false. Kessler followed up, nodding as he added, "He tensed up. We feared for our safety and had no choice but to restrain him." More lies. Under the table, Jamal's fingers curled into fists. He had spent his entire career fighting against this kind of blatant corruption, and now he was experiencing it firsthand. Judge Holloway barely concealed her impatience as she glanced toward Jamal's lawyer, signaling that the balance of power in the courtroom had already been decided. "Anything else, Mr. Rivera?" Rivera paused. He knew this judge well, knew her record all too clearly. She cared little for fairness. Still, he swallowed hard and pressed on. "Yes, Your Honor." Then the defense called Jamal Winslow to the stand. This was the moment of truth. As Jamal rose and walked to the witness stand, he felt every eye in the room fixed on him, watching, judging, waiting to see if he would crack. But he would not, because what was about to happen would change everything. Jamal sat down in the witness chair, exhaling slowly as the court clerk administered the oath. His hands rested lightly on his lap, yet inside he simmered with resolve. He wasn't there merely to defend himself, he was there to expose the truth. Prosecutor Calloway then stepped forward, pacing with a needless display of confidence. "Mr. Winslow, would you say that you complied with the officer's instructions during your traffic stop?" Jamal met his gaze, calm and measured. "I asked why I was ordered to exit my car. That, in itself, isn't illegal," Jamal replied. Calloway feigned a sigh. "So, you refused to exit, correct?" he pressed. "I asked why I was compelled to step out, and I maintained that legally I have the right to remain in my vehicle." Calloway smirked, casting a dismissive glance at the jury, as though Jamal's intelligence were merely an inconvenience. "And even after multiple orders, you still didn't comply?" Jamal held his unyielding stare. "Because there was no lawful reason to do so." Calloway turned to the judge, shaking his head as if expecting nothing less. "Your Honor, it's clear that the defendant—" Jamal leaned forward, his voice steady. "Before we proceed further, I should probably disclose something." A moment of silence fell over the room. Calloway hesitated. Even Judge Holloway looked up, actually focusing on him for the first time. Jamal reached into his briefcase. His lawyer, Rivera, tensed, uncertain of what was coming. Slowly, Jamal pulled out his badge, a small, unassuming rectangle that had suddenly become the most potent item in the courtroom. "I am Jamal Winslow," he declared, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District." The room froze. Judge Holloway's lips parted slightly as her gavel hovered above her desk, unmoving. The officers stiffened. Kessler's knee bounced under the table. Driscoll's jaw tightened. Calloway's face turned pale. Excuse me. Jamal tilted his head. Did I stutter? The air shifted. The jury leaned forward. The stenographer halted her typing. Even Rivera, his own lawyer, looked as if he'd been hit by a freight train. You're a federal prosecutor. Calloway's voice wavered just a bit. Jamal held up his ID. That's exactly what it says, doesn't it? And just like that, the entire case imploded. Judge Holloway leaned back, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew that if she ruled against Jamal now, if she dismissed his testimony and sided with these officers, this would not be just another forgotten case. It would become a scandal. The courtroom was no longer merely a room. It had turned into a powder keg, and Jamal had just lit the fuse. The entire courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. Judge Holloway's grip on her gavel tightened, yet she did not strike it down. Not yet. She was thinking, calculating. This was no longer a routine case. It was a potential career-ending disaster waiting to happen. Calloway swallowed hard. His smooth, effortless arrogance evaporated in an instant. He glanced at the officers, and for the first time, both Driscoll and Kessler appeared visibly nervous. Jamal sat quietly, observing the silent scramble for control. He had witnessed these power plays 100 times before, in boardrooms, in back-office meetings, in hushed conversations among prosecutors when a problematic case landed on their desks. But now, the tables had turned. He was the one forcing their hand. I wasn't aware of this information, Calloway stammered, rifling through his files as if desperately searching for an escape route. Your Honor, Judge Holloway raised her hand, instantly silencing him. For the first time, her eyes locked onto Jamal's, and his mere presence had become a threat. A government prosecutor wrongfully arrested, assaulted, and misrepresented. If this had gone unnoticed, he might have become just another nameless statistic, and she knew it well. Turning to the officers, she said firmly, Driscoll, Kessler. Both men straightened up immediately, like children caught in the act. Would you like to amend your statements? She asked. A heavy silence fell, a clear crack in their composed facades that Jamal could see. Driscoll's fingers curled around his knee, and Kessler looked toward Calloway as if pleading for a lifeline. Then Jamal spoke first. Before you answer that, Your Honor, I request that the court pull the dispatch call logs from the night of my arrest. Calloway flinched. Jamal wasn't speculating. He understood exactly how these procedures worked. If those officers had radioed in before stopping me, their fabricated excuse about the taillight wouldn't hold water. If they hadn't, then they had violated protocol from the very start. Judge Holloway studied him for a long, heavy moment. She was caught in a dilemma. If she denied his request, it would look like she was burying evidence. If she granted it, she would be delivering the final blow to the prosecution's case. After a measured pause and a clearing of her throat, she said, Request granted. Driscoll exhaled sharply, his composure finally cracking, while Kessler shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching. They both knew what was coming next. Jamal leaned back in his seat, and he wasn't finished yet. This case was about to break free from the confines of that courtroom. It all started with a single reporter in the back, a young journalist from the Baton Rouge Advocate, furiously tapping away on her laptop. Within hours, the story exploded. By the next morning, Jamal's name was plastered everywhere. Headlines blared, Assistant U.S. Attorney wrongfully arrested by Baton Rouge cops, Federal prosecutor exposes corrupt officers in open court, and Judge under fire for bias against black defendant who is a government lawyer. The internet erupted as social media flooded with clips shot inside the courtroom by onlookers. The moment Jamal revealed his badge became a viral sensation, spreading across platforms like wildfire. Cable news networks ran segments on the case's broader implications. How many others had been railroaded like Jamal without the power or position to fight back? But the most dramatic shift happened right in Baton Rouge itself. Community activists organized rallies, and protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. Civil rights attorneys dug into old cases handled by Judge Holloway, searching for patterns of bias and injustice. Then the real blow came, a damning anonymous leak. Internal police records surfaced, emails between officers conspiring on how to justify questionable stops, and testimonies from other black drivers who had been pulled over, cited for bogus violations, and even threatened with arrest if they dared to object. Suddenly, the case wasn't solely about Jamal Winslow. It was about a system that had long operated in the shadows, and now the floodlights were on. Yet those in power weren't about to go down without a fight. The backlash was immediate. City officials scrambled, and the police department issued a carefully worded statement. Even Judge Holloway's office suddenly went silent, no longer returning calls. By week's end, the Baton Rouge Police Department announced an internal investigation, a weak performative gesture that Jamal had seen before, a mere distraction designed to placate the public without effecting real change. But this time, it wasn't enough. The pressure continued to build. A civil rights attorney filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of past victims, and community leaders demanded that Judge Holloway be removed from the bench. Protesters refused to back down. Then came the true moment of reckoning. The case was turned over to Louisiana's Attorney General for review. Jamal sat in his apartment watching the press conference, his phone incessantly buzzing with calls from journalists and lawyers. People who had experienced what he had, yet lacked the badge to fight back. This wasn't just damage control anymore, they were running out of ways to hide. And Judge Holloway, she knew it. By the time Jamal returned to court for the verdict, her expression had shifted. Gone was the casual disinterest and overconfidence. Now, she was facing a case too enormous to sweep under the rug, forced to decide which side of history she would stand on. But would her decision deliver genuine justice, or was it merely another calculated move to protect the system? The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Judge Holloway cleared her throat, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her. With the protests, the media scrutiny, and the leaked files all laid bare, it was clear that this decision no longer belonged solely to her. It was in the hands of the public. She exhaled slowly, setting her gavel down softly. After reviewing the evidence, the court pronounced its verdict. There was a brief, tense pause. Then, finally, not guilty. A surge of relief washed over Jamal, yet he remained still, unresponsive for now, because this case was bigger than just him. The officers sat rigidly, their faces drained of color. Kessler's hands were tightly clenched, his career flashing before his eyes, while Driscoll, ever the more arrogant of the pair, leaned in and began, "Your Honor, we—" The judge interrupted by raising her hand. "The court will forward all relevant materials to the state attorney's office for further review." That was all. The officers were not going to simply walk away from this. The courtroom erupted with murmurs and gasps, punctuated by the rapid clicking of reporters' cameras and keyboards. For the first time, the system had turned its own gaze inward. Slowly, Jamal rose to his feet. His lawyer patted him on the back, but Jamal's eyes were fixed on the officers, on the prosecutor, Calloway, who looked as though he had just lost everything, and on the judge, who had spent years dismissing cases like his until now. Yet most of all, Jamal thought of those who hadn't been as fortunate, the people who had sat in this very courtroom before him, who never got the chance to walk free. As he exited the courtroom, cameras flashed, Reporters shouted questions, and the crowd cheered. But Jamal wasn't celebrating. This wasn't a triumph. It was undeniable proof, evidence of what had always been happening behind the scenes. Now, with the world watching, the system had been forced to react, and he knew the fight was far from over, not for him, and certainly not for those still trapped in it. He stepped past the blinking lights into the crowd, where voices demanded real change, because one case alone wasn't enough. And now, no one was looking away. If this story made you pause, even for a second, then ask yourself, how many more stories like this are hidden out there? How many people never get their day in court? Their names never hit the headlines, their truths remain unheard. It's not enough to merely witness injustice. We must challenge it. So, if you believe that true justice means holding power accountable, then share this story, talk about it, and pay attention. Because the more people who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes for these cases to be swept under the rug. And that is exactly how change begins.